So let us first start talking about the aggregate demand, which is abbreviated as AD. Now, like I told you in the immediate previous video, that here in the macroeconomy we are not looking at a particular good or service, but we are looking at the entire volume of goods and services produced in an economy during the year, and that is basically your GDP. And since we are taking the price adjusted GDP, so we are calling it the real GDP. And then on the y-axis you have an indicator for the average prices of goods and services in the economy, which is your GDP deflator, right? Now, what is basically your aggregate demand? Your aggregate demand is looking at the demand for all goods and services that are produced in this economy. So your aggregate demand is basically a relationship. It is basically a relationship between real GDP, the RGDP, and the price index, that is the GDP deflator, okay, the price index, which we called capital P, which we denoted by capital P. Now, this aggregate demand is numerically, quantity wise, it should be the same as the real GDP. So, the value of aggregate demand is the same as real GDP. So, we could say that aggregate demand is actually identically, it is same as real GDP. Please understand, numerically it is the same, because aggregate demand is the demand for the total volume of goods and services produced in this economy, right? And real GDP is the production of the total value of goods and services. It's the value of all goods and services produced. So numerically these two things are the same, but intuitively they are not the same. Real GDP is just looking at the production, the total value of production of goods and services in the economy, whereas aggregate demand is showing the relationship of that production at the different price levels, at the different price indices in the economy during the year. So aggregate demand is the relationship between these two, although numerically, quantity wise, it is the same as real GDP. Okay, so now let us try to track the aggregate demand. How are we getting the aggregate demand? What is aggregate demand made of, right? Aggregate demand is made of, it consists of the demand of all sectors of the economy, because remember in the 4-sector circular flow model we said that any economy at the macro level is made up of these 4 sectors, isn't it? So the aggregate demand, the total demand of the economy should be generated by these 4 sectors of the economy. If I ask you what is the total demand of your economy, you will basically say, okay, households demand so much, government demands so much, the foreign sector demands so much, and the business firms demand so much. And you add all of that up, and that should give you actually the aggregate demand of the economy. So can we say that the aggregate demand is actually the demand generated by 4 sectors of the economy? Okay. And if the law of demand which holds in the micro level, if that law of demand holds at the macro level also, then this aggregate demand which is generated by the 4 sectors of the economy, it should follow the law of demand, which means that as the price index P, as the price index increases, the aggregate demand for every sector should go down, and hence the aggregate demand of the entire economy should go down. And similarly, as the price index P goes down, then aggregate demand for the entire economy should be going up, and this should be true given the ceteris paribus condition, given that everything else in the economy is the same. In other words, what we are trying to say is, as the economy in general becomes expensive, as prices rise in the economy, And once again, please note, this is not the price of any particular commodity or service. This is the average price level of the economy. If that rises, then the aggregate demand for the economy goes down, and that goes down because the demand of each sector of the economy goes down, because every sector is also rational. They are not going to demand more at a higher price, and they are going to demand more at a lower price. So the law of demand will be true at the macro level, so that we will get this relationship given everything else in the market is constant. Now, one way of looking at this aggregate demand is basically looking at the total expenditure, right? Well, how do we know what is demanded? We know what is demanded based on how much money has been spent by this person. Like if I did not know your demand and I wanted to track what your demand is, one way of doing that would be going to you and asking you, hey, how many oranges did you buy? And you tell me 6 oranges. Or how many shirts did you buy? And you said, tell me 10 oranges. So that gives me an idea about what your demand for oranges is or what your demand for shirts is, right? So your total spending gives an idea about your aggregate demand. So basically this aggregate demand is once again equivalent to the total expenditure of the economy, the total spending of the economy. Expenditure basically means spending. Total expenditure, and let's call that TE, where this TE is nothing but the expenditure of the 4 sectors of the economy, that is the consumption expenditure of the households, the investment spending of the firms, the government spending, capital G, plus the net exports, that is X minus M. If you remember, NX, we have covered that in module 3. If you need to refresh your memory, go back to module 3 unit 1 and take a look at the circular flow diagram and the immediate next video, right? So the total spending of the economy is coming from the individual spending of the sectors. And please note that if the price index goes up, if the economy becomes expensive, then the households will consume less, the business firms will invest less, the government will be buying less goods and services, and the foreign sector will also be buying less goods from us, because our goods will be relatively more expensive in the global market because there has been a price rise in our economy, right? Similarly, if the prices in our economy go down, if our economy becomes cheaper, then our households will consume more, our business firms will invest more, our government will be spending more on goods and services, and the foreigners will also be buying more from us because our goods will be relatively cheaper in the world market or the global market. So basically, this inverse relationship that we get between price index and aggregate demand is driven by the inverse relationship between price index and the total expenditure. So basically, can we say that as price index goes up, this is very important, this part, as price index goes up, the total expenditure of the economy goes down, hence the aggregate demand for the economy goes down, and so the real GDP of the economy goes down. I hope you can see that. Okay, and the opposite is also true. As the price index goes down, the total expenditure of the economy goes up, the aggregate demand for the economy goes up, hence, and so the real GDP of the economy goes up. Okay, where this total expenditure is basically C plus I plus G plus NX, and the aggregate demand is driven by the total expenditure and the real GDP is driven by the aggregate demand. Okay. Now, whenever there is an increase in the price index in the economy, this is known as inflation. And whenever there is a decrease in the real GDP in the economy, this is known as stagnation. So we could say that inflation actually leads to stagnation in the economy. And whenever there is a decrease in the price index, that is known as deflation, the opposite of inflation. And whenever there is an increase in the real GDP, this is basically called growth or economic growth. That is what we mean by growth. Now once again, growth and development are not the same thing. Okay, that's one of your topics for the discussion board that you're doing on Blackboard. So that is something I want you to research into. Growth and development do not mean the same thing. Growth is just one component of development. A country could be growing, it could have a rise in real GDP, yet it may not have development. So that is something you need to research on for your discussion board, okay? I'm not going into that. That's for you to find out. Now, so that means deflation actually leads to growth, everything else in the economy staying constant. So can we say under the aggregate demand model, we can say that inflation leads to stagnation and deflation will lead to growth. And given all of this relationship, if I go back to my two-dimensional diagram, if I go back to the macroeconomic diagram, let me put this, let me put this here, AD identical to real GDP. Okay. If I go back to my macroeconomic two-dimensional diagram, so I have real GDP on the x-axis, that's in terms of dollars. I have my GDP deflator capital P here, which is not in terms of dollars, it is in real terms. If all this is true, then please note that the aggregate demand curve is going to be a downward sloping line, just like the ordinary demand curve, D curve, that we have looked at in module 2. However, this is the aggregate demand curve, so I'm going to call it AD, right? And please note that every point on this aggregate demand curve, each and every point, and you could have numerous such points, those points are basically representing the total expenditure of the economy. Every point is representing the total expenditure of the economy at that particular price index, P1, P2, P3 and P4. Do you see that? Every point on the AD curve is basically representing the total expenditure of the economy, where the total expenditure is coming from the consumption at that price index, the investment at that price index, the government expenditure at that price index, and the net exports at the price index. That is what it means, right? So if there is a drop in the price index, if there is deflation, then like I said, the total expenditure goes up because individually all of those would go up, and so you are moving towards the right every time. And as you are moving a little bit towards the right, the aggregate demand is going up and the real GDP of the economy is going up on the x-axis. Okay, so that is the mechanism that we have in the aggregate demand model, which leads to a downward shift, a downward slope of the aggregate demand curve. Now in the next video we will talk about what is really the reason behind this downward slope. Why do we actually see this inverse relationship? What lies in the next layer? We are going another layer deeper in the next video and trying to explain what is the theory that gives rise to this inverse relationship that we see here, and then we will talk about the shifts of the aggregate demand curve in the next video.